A new police chief arrives to reform a broken precinct, but her first encounter is with a racist officer who spits in her face. Unaware, she holds the power to transform his entire career. As the officer's dark past comes to light, tensions rise and hard truths are revealed. Can accountability and redemption coexist in a system built on prejudice? This gripping tale of justice and second chances will leave you questioning the power of change. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the bustling city street, where Officer Mark Reynolds idled in his patrol car. His mirrored sunglasses reflected a pair of teenagers skateboarding across the sidewalk, drawing a small smirk from his thin lips. Loitering, he muttered to himself, though he made no move to intervene. Mark Reynolds had been on the force for 15 years, and while his record showed years of service, his reputation was less flattering. Among his colleagues, he was known for his arrogance and tendency to single out minorities during routine stops, though his behavior often skirted the line of what could be proven as misconduct. As he turned his gaze back to the precinct parking lot, his attention snapped to a sleek black car parked just outside the entrance. A black woman in a sharp navy blazer and neatly pressed trousers stepped out, carrying a leather portfolio. Her composure, her confidence, it irritated him almost instantly. "Who's this now?" he muttered, stepping out of his car and adjusting his belt. Maya Brooks closed the car door gently, her heels clicking softly on the pavement as she walked toward the precinct entrance. She carried herself with calm authority, her head held high, her sharp eyes scanning the building. She wasn't in a rush, but there was no hesitation in her stride. Reynolds approached, his posture stiff, his voice sharp. "Excuse me, ma'am. This is police property. You can't park here unless you're here on official business." Maya turned, meeting his gaze with a polite but firm expression. "I am here on official business," she said, her tone measured and clear. Reynolds narrowed his eyes, stepping closer. "Really? And what kind of business would that be?" he asked, his words dripping with condescension. Maya held her ground, her calm demeanor unshaken. "That's not your concern. If you'll excuse me." "It is my concern," Reynolds interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "I don't recognize you, and we don't just let anyone waltz into a precinct. So why don't you tell me who you are before I have to call this in?" The tension in the air thickened. A few pedestrians across the street slowed their steps, sensing the confrontation. Maya took a slow breath, refusing to be rattled. "Officer, I've answered your question. I have official business here, and I don't need your permission to proceed," she said, her voice steady but carrying an edge of finality. Reynolds' jaw tightened, his ego flared at her refusal to defer to his authority. "Listen, lady," he snapped, stepping closer. "I don't know who you think you are, but you don't talk to me like that. Not here. Not on my watch." Maya's gaze didn't waver. "If you're finished, I'd like to be on my way now," she said, her voice still calm, though her grip on the leather portfolio tightened slightly. Reynolds' face twisted with frustration. Without thinking, he spat, literally at her, a glob of spit landing just below her cheek. For a brief moment, the world seemed to pause. A few feet away, a man crossing the street froze mid-step, staring in disbelief. Maya, too, stood motionless, her lips pressing into a thin line. Reynolds smirked, his chest puffed out as if daring her to retaliate. Maya reached into her pocket, retrieving a handkerchief. She wiped her face with slow, deliberate movements, her expression unreadable. Then she met Reynolds' gaze again, her calm now more unnerving than before. "Your badge number, officer," she said evenly. Reynolds hesitated, his smirk faltering. "What?" "You heard me," Maya said, her voice sharper now. "Your badge number." Reynolds scoffed. "And what exactly do you plan to do with that?" Maya didn't respond. Instead, she folded her handkerchief, slipped it back into her pocket, and turned toward the precinct entrance. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she walked away, leaving Reynolds standing in the parking lot, unsure whether he had won or lost the exchange. Inside the precinct, Maya's presence caused a subtle stir. A few officers turned their heads as she passed, some whispering among themselves. One officer, a senior sergeant, straightened his posture immediately upon seeing her. "Chief Brooks," he greeted her with a respectful nod. "Sergeant," Maya replied, her tone professional. She continued down the hall, her stride purposeful and her mind focused. Outside, Reynolds watched her disappear into the building, a nagging unease creeping up his spine. Little did he know, the woman he had just disrespected was not only here on official business. She was his new boss. The precinct's break room buzzed with low chatter as officers filed into the main meeting hall. It was an ordinary day. At least that's what most of them assumed. Officer Mark Reynolds leaned against the wall, sipping coffee from a chipped mug. His shift had ended, but he had been told to stay for an important announcement. "New chiefs coming in today," a fellow officer muttered as he passed Reynolds. Reynolds snorted. "Another pencil pusher, probably. Someone to make speeches and shuffle papers." The other officer gave a non-committal shrug. "Heard this one's got a reputation, supposed to be a real hardliner on discipline. Guess we'll see." Reynolds rolled his eyes. "Discipline? Great. Another one of those reformers. As if we don't have enough hoops to jump through already." Still, curiosity prickled at the edges of his cynicism. He took a seat in the middle of the room, just far enough back to avoid being noticed, but close enough to hear every word. The meeting hall filled quickly, and a low hum of conversation rose above the sound of chairs scraping the floor. The officers' voices held a mix of skepticism and curiosity. "Did you hear she took down that corruption ring in Jackson Heights?" a young officer whispered. "I heard she doesn't tolerate any nonsense. She's fired whole squads before," replied another. "She?" Reynolds perked up at the pronoun. His brows furrowed, and he leaned slightly forward, pretending to scroll through his phone but listening intently. Before he could process the murmurs, the precinct captain entered, silencing the room with a wave of his hand. "Good afternoon," the captain began, his voice steady but tinged with something almost nervous. "As you all know, today we welcome a new chief of police to the precinct. Chief Brooks has built a remarkable career reforming some of the toughest departments in the state." Reynolds' mug froze halfway to his lips. Brooks? The name sparked something in his memory, but he couldn't place it. The captain continued. "Chief Brooks has a reputation for enforcing accountability and fostering trust between the police force and the community. I trust you'll give her your full cooperation as we work to make this precinct a model for the department." The captain stepped aside, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, the woman from the parking lot strode confidently into the room. Reynolds' stomach dropped. He barely managed to keep his jaw from hitting the floor. It was her, the same woman he had confronted just hours ago. The professional attire, the calm authority, the unflinching gaze. She walked with purpose, her heels clicking on the tile floor as if punctuating her arrival. She stopped at the podium, letting her eyes sweep over the room. There was no smile, no attempt at warmth, only a quiet confidence that filled the space. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady and clear. "I'm Chief Maya Brooks. It's an honor to join this precinct and work alongside all of you." Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his pulse quickening. He avoided eye contact, pretending to look at his notes, but every word she spoke felt directed at him. Maya's speech wasn't long, but it was pointed. "This precinct has a history, some of it good, some of it not so good," she said, her tone sharpening. "My goal is simple, to ensure this department becomes a model of integrity and professionalism. Accountability will not be optional. Every officer, regardless of rank or tenure, will be held to the highest standard." Her gaze swept across the room, landing briefly on Reynolds, who felt a chill run down his spine. "I know change isn't easy," she continued, "but it's necessary. Our community depends on us to serve and protect, not to intimidate or discriminate. Earning their trust is not just our job, it's our duty." As the room fell into a hushed silence, Maya paused, letting her words sink in. "I've heard about some of the challenges this precinct has faced. I'm here to address those challenges head on. Together, we'll build a department this community can trust. But let me be clear. Anyone who stands in the way of that progress will not have a place here." The officers exchanged wary glances. Reynolds' palms were damp, his earlier bravado completely gone. He felt as if the room was closing in on him. the walls shrinking with every word she spoke. When Maya concluded, she stepped back from the podium, her composure unbroken. The captain clapped politely, followed by a hesitant ripple of applause from the room. As the officers filed out, Reynolds lingered, hoping to blend into the background. But as he turned to leave, Maya's voice cut through the noise. "Officer Reynolds." He froze, his heart pounding. Slowly, he turned to face her. She stood a few feet away, her arms crossed, a faint but unmistakable glint in her eyes. "We'll talk soon," she said, her tone leaving no room for doubt. Reynolds nodded stiffly, muttering a quick, "Yes, Chief." He hurried out of the room, his mind racing. For the first time in his career, Mark Reynolds felt a crack in his armor. This wasn't going to be just another chief. This was Maya Brooks, and he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The precinct conference room was empty now, save for Chief Maya Brooks. She stood near the window, gazing out at the bustling city. The reflection of her calm yet intense expression in the glass hinted at the memories stirring beneath her composed exterior. The first memory was of her childhood, a hot summer day in her small hometown. She was only 8 years old, standing on the porch of their modest home with her father. A commotion echoed from the street as 2 police cars pulled up in front of their neighbor's house. "Stay here," her father said, his voice tight as he walked toward the scene. Maya watched as her father calmly asked the officers why they were dragging their neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, out of his house in handcuffs. Mr. Jenkins, a kind man who often shared stories with the neighborhood kids, pleaded his innocence. "What's going on?" her father had asked. "Step back, sir," one of the officers barked. "We're handling it." Her father didn't step back. "Handling what? Jenkins hasn't done anything wrong." Without warning, one officer shoved him, sending him stumbling back. Young Maya's small hands gripped the porch railing tightly, her chest tightening with fear and helplessness as she saw the anger and humiliation in her father's eyes. That day, Maya vowed she would never stand idly by in the face of injustice again. The memory shifted, and now Maya was a young recruit at the academy. She was the only black woman in her training cohort, and it didn't take long for some of her peers to remind her of it. "You sure you're in the right place, Brooks?" one cadet sneered as she walked past the training field. "This isn't a community center." She ignored him at first, focusing on her drill. But when the comments became louder and more pointed, she turned to face him. "You have something to say to me?" she asked calmly. The cadet smirked. "Just wondering how long you'll last." "Longer than you," she said, holding his gaze until his smirk faltered. Maya didn't just last, she excelled. She graduated near the top of her class, earning the respect of instructors and many of her peers. But it was clear the path ahead wouldn't be easy. Years later, as a young officer in a notoriously corrupt precinct, Maya faced her biggest challenge yet. She'd uncovered evidence of misconduct by several senior officers, false arrests, excessive force, and missing evidence. When she presented her findings to her captain, he dismissed her outright. "You don't know how things work around here, Brooks," he said with a patronizing smile. "You need to focus on your job and leave the big stuff to the big boys." But Maya wasn't deterred. She took her findings directly to internal affairs. The fallout was swift and brutal. Several officers were removed from duty, and Maya became a pariah among many of her colleagues. One day, as she walked into the locker room, she found graffiti scrawled across her locker. "Snitch." She paused, her jaw tightening. Then she calmly grabbed a rag and wiped it away. That moment solidified her resolve. She knew the price of doing the right thing, and she was willing to pay it. The final memory came from her time as a lieutenant in a community struggling with tension between the police and residents. After a controversial shooting, protests erupted, and the department braced for riots. Maya, however, had a different approach. She walked out to the protest line without riot gear, her hands raised in a gesture of peace. "I'm Lieutenant Maya Brooks," she said, her voice steady but carrying over the crowd. "I hear you, and I want to work with you to make things better." The tension in the air didn't disappear, but it softened. Over the next months, Maya worked tirelessly to build trust with the community, implementing policies that emphasized de-escalation and transparency. It wasn't easy, but it worked. Crime rates fell, and community-police relations improved significantly. Maya's leadership earned her statewide recognition and her next promotion. As the memories faded, Maya stood in the present once more, her gaze hardening with purpose. Every challenge, every fight, every victory had led her to this moment. Reynolds and others like him didn't know it yet, but change had already arrived. Maya wasn't just here to lead this precinct, she was here to transform it. The office was dimly lit, except for the soft glow of Maya Brooks' computer screen. Her brows knit in concentration as she scrolled through precinct records, a cup of coffee cooling on the corner of her desk. Stacks of reports, complaints, and incident logs cluttered the space around her, each one a potential thread in the web of misconduct she was determined to unravel. For days, Maya had immersed herself in the precinct's history, poring over case files and disciplinary reports. The deeper she dug, the more troubling patterns emerged. Incidents of excessive force, falsified charges, and community complaints were disturbingly common. Worse, many of these cases were dismissed with vague justifications, and the names of the same officers appeared repeatedly. One name stood out: Officer Mark Reynolds. The more Maya read, the clearer the picture became. Reynolds had been named in multiple complaints over the years: harassment during routine stops, unnecessary escalation during arrests, and even allegations of planted evidence. Yet each complaint had been swept under the rug, either dismissed outright or resolved with a cursory warning. Maya paused on one case: a teenager accused of theft, arrested by Reynolds after a heated altercation. The report claimed the boy resisted arrest, but a closer look revealed glaring inconsistencies. Witness statements contradicted Reynolds' account, suggesting the teenager had been compliant before things turned physical. No charges were filed, but the incident had left a lasting scar on the community. Her jaw tightened as she realized how deep the problem ran. Reynolds wasn't just a bad apple. He was a symptom of a larger, more systemic issue. Word spread quickly through the precinct that Chief Brooks was combing through records. Officers whispered in hallways, their voices low and anxious. For some, it was business as usual. But for others, those with skeletons in their closets, the news sparked unease. Reynolds, usually brash and confident, found himself glancing over his shoulder. At first, he dismissed Maya's investigation as performative, a typical new chief move to establish dominance. But as days passed, he noticed changes that made him uneasy. Routine meetings were suddenly filled with pointed questions. Maya's calm, direct gaze seemed to pierce through excuses, and her insistence on accountability was unwavering. "She's digging for something," Reynolds muttered to a colleague after one such meeting. "Why else would she be pulling records from years ago?" His colleague shrugged, but the tension in his face mirrored Reynolds' unease. "She's serious, that's for sure. And if she finds anything—" The words hung heavy in the air, unspoken but understood. Determined to root out the rot, Maya began holding private meetings with individual officers. These weren't casual chats. They were thorough, pointed interrogations. She reviewed past incidents with each officer, challenging inconsistencies and asking tough questions. One officer, a patrolman with a spotless record, left her office visibly shaken. "She asked about everything," he confided to a friend. "Even stuff from my rookie years. It's like she already knows the answers." For others, the experience was even more daunting. Reynolds' turn came on a Thursday afternoon. He entered Maya's office with forced nonchalance, but his rigid posture and fidgeting hands betrayed his nerves. "Officer Reynolds?" Maya greeted him, her tone neutral but firm. "Have a seat," he complied, his gaze flicking to the folders spread across her desk. His name was on several of them. "I've been reviewing your record," Maya began. "There are some concerns I'd like to address." "Concerns?" Reynolds forced a chuckle. "With all due respect, Chief, I've been on the force for 15 years. I've always done my job." Maya didn't flinch. "That's what I'm here to determine." She slid one of the folders toward him. "Let's start with this incident from 2 years ago." She laid out the details with precision, every inconsistency, every piece of evidence that contradicted his report. Reynolds tried to defend himself, but his explanations grew weaker as Maya calmly dismantled his narrative. By the time the meeting ended, his confidence had crumbled. As Maya's investigation deepened, the precinct became a divided house. Some officers supported her efforts, viewing her as a beacon of much-needed change. Others resented her, clinging to the old ways and fearing what her reforms might uncover. Reynolds found himself increasingly isolated. Once a loud, dominant presence in the precinct, he now avoided the break room and rarely joined conversations. His colleagues, sensing the walls closing in around him, began to distance themselves. "She's going to bury you," one officer said bluntly after a tense interaction with Maya. Reynolds didn't respond. He felt the pressure mounting, his career hanging by a thread. The breaking point came during a precinct-wide meeting. Maya stood at the front of the room, addressing the officers with her usual calm authority. "We are here to serve and protect," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "But we cannot do that without accountability. This department has failed in the past, failed the community, and failed itself. That ends now." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "Every officer here will be held to the highest standard. If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. But if you've engaged in misconduct, understand this. I will find it, and there will be consequences." The room was silent, the tension palpable. Reynolds sat in the back, his fists clenched beneath the table. He felt the eyes of his peers on him, their judgment heavy. That night, Reynolds sat alone in his apartment, the files from his meeting with Maya replaying in his mind. For the first time, he felt the weight of his actions, not just the fear of getting caught, but the deeper realization of the harm he had caused. He thought of the teenager he'd arrested, the community he'd dismissed, the trust he'd broken. And for the first time, he wondered if he could make it right, or if it was already too late. The investigation wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the future of the precinct, the community, and whether he could be a part of it. As the clock struck midnight, Reynolds made a decision. He would confront his past and face whatever came next. The faint hum of the precinct's fluorescent lights buzzed as Officer Mark Reynolds made his way down the hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last. He adjusted his uniform, tugging at his collar as though it might loosen the tight knot of anxiety in his chest. Outside Chief Maya Brooks' office, the blinds were drawn, and her door stood ajar. "Come in, Officer Reynolds," came Maya's calm, authoritative voice. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The office was minimalist but purposeful. Awards and framed photos of community events lined one wall, while a few neatly stacked files sat on the desk. Reynolds' gaze landed on the single open folder in front of her, the edges of his own name visible on the paperwork inside. "Have a seat," Maya said, gesturing to the chair opposite her. Reynolds complied, though his posture was stiff and his eyes avoided hers. "I'll get straight to the point, Officer Reynolds," Maya began, her tone even but unyielding. "I've been reviewing your record, and there are some serious concerns we need to address." Reynolds shifted in his seat. "With all due respect, Chief, I've been on this job for 15 years. I've always done what's expected of me." Maya raised an eyebrow unimpressed. "What's expected of you?" she repeated, leaning forward slightly. "Does that include multiple complaints of harassment, excessive force, and a blatant disregard for protocol?" "Those complaints were investigated and dismissed," Reynolds said quickly, his voice tinged with defensiveness. Maya didn't flinch. "Dismissed isn't the same as resolved. I've gone through those investigations, and let's just say the conclusions were questionable, at best." She slid the folder across the desk toward him, her fingers resting on its edge. "Take this incident, for example, the arrest of a 17-year-old boy 2 years ago. Your report states he resisted arrest. Witnesses said otherwise. Care to explain the discrepancy?" Reynolds' face flushed. "Kids like him, they act out. They push limits. I did what I thought was necessary to control the situation." Maya's gaze sharpened. "Kids like him?" she repeated, her voice laced with quiet intensity. Reynolds hesitated, realizing too late the implication of his words. "You know what I mean," he muttered, though his confidence wavered. "No, Officer Reynolds," Maya said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "I don't know what you mean, but I do know this. Your actions that day damaged more than just one life. They damaged the trust this community has in us. And it's not an isolated case." Reynolds leaned forward, his frustration bubbling over. "Chief, You don't understand the kind of pressure we're under out there. We're stretched thin, and the public's got it out for us. We do what we can to keep things from falling apart. Sometimes that means making tough calls. Maya leaned back, her calm demeanor unshaken. Tough calls don't mean cutting corners or abusing power. That's not pressure. That's a choice. And choices have consequences. She opened another folder, her movements deliberate. This isn't just about one or two incidents, Officer Reynolds. It's a pattern of misconduct that puts this entire department at risk. Reynolds felt the walls closing in, his usual bravado crumbling under the weight of her words. Look, I'm not perfect, he said, his tone softer now. But the system's broken. What do you expect us to do when we're given a broken playbook? Maya's eyes softened slightly, though her resolve remained firm. You're right. The system is broken. That's why I'm here. But blaming the system doesn't absolve you of personal responsibility. You had the choice to do better, and you chose not to. Now you have another choice to make. Maya closed the folders and clasped her hands on the desk, her expression unwavering. Here's how this is going to work. You can cooperate with the reforms I'm implementing, take accountability for your actions, and work to rebuild trust with this community. If you're willing to do that, there may be a path forward for you. And if I don't? Reynolds asked, though the question was more rhetorical than defiant. If you don't, Maya said, leaning in slightly, you will face disciplinary action. Your record will be reviewed by external investigators, and every questionable decision you've ever made will be scrutinized. If there's misconduct to be found, and there is, you'll be held accountable. Publicly. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of her words settling over him. Reynolds exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging. He looked at Maya, his expression a mixture of anger, shame, and something else. Perhaps the faintest glimmer of understanding. You're not giving me much of a choice, he muttered. You're right, Maya said. I'm not. But that's because this isn't about you. It's about the people we serve and the trust we're supposed to protect. It's about making this department better than it was yesterday. And I need officers who are willing to be part of that change. Reynolds nodded reluctantly, his gaze dropping to the floor. I'll think about it, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You do that, Maya replied, standing as a signal that the meeting was over. But don't take too long, the clock is ticking. Reynolds rose, his movements slow and deliberate. As he turned to leave, Maya's voice stopped him once more. And Reynolds? He paused, glancing over his shoulder. Change isn't optional, she said firmly. It's inevitable. The only question is whether you'll be part of it. Reynolds gave a faint nod and walked out of the office, the door clicking shut behind him. The precinct felt different now. The air was heavier, the once familiar camaraderie muted under the weight of uncertainty. For Officer Mark Reynolds, the change wasn't just external, it was within him, a gnawing unease that refused to be ignored. Sitting in the break room, Reynolds fidgeted with his coffee cup, the bitter liquid long gone cold. Across the table sat Officer Greg Harper, a senior colleague, and someone Reynolds considered a confidant. She's tearing this place apart, Reynolds muttered, his voice low but tinged with frustration. 15 years on this job, and now everything I've done is under a microscope. Harper shrugged, his expression thoughtful. Maybe it should be, Mark. Maybe we all need to take a hard look at how we've been doing things. Reynolds narrowed his eyes. What's that supposed to mean? It means, Harper said, leaning forward, that maybe some of what she's saying isn't wrong. I've read the same reports you have. Some of the stuff we've ignored. Hell, some of the stuff we've done. It's not right. And you know it. Reynolds opened his mouth to argue but found the words stuck in his throat. He clenched his jaw, unwilling to admit Harper had a point. Later that day, Reynolds was assigned to monitor a community outreach event Maya had organized. It was a simple gathering at a local park, a chance for officers to meet with residents in a less formal setting. Reynolds lingered at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, his uniform pristine but his face drawn tight with skepticism. He watched as Maya moved through the group, speaking to people with genuine interest and concern. A middle-aged woman approached him hesitantly, her young son clutching her hand. "Officer," she began, her voice steady but laced with tension. "I recognize you." Reynolds tensed. "Oh? You arrested my nephew 2 years ago," she said. "Said he resisted, but he didn't, did he?" Reynolds stared at her, the memory surfacing with uncomfortable clarity. "He's a good kid," the woman continued. "But that day, that arrest, it changed him, made him think the system was against him. He doesn't trust anyone in uniform now, and you did that." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He wanted to defend himself, to claim he was just doing his job, but the truth was staring him in the face. He had made choices that hurt people. As the woman walked away, Reynolds felt a weight settle on his chest. That evening, Reynolds passed Maya's office. The door was slightly ajar, and he paused, watching as she worked late into the night. Her desk was cluttered with files, a cup of coffee steaming beside her. She looked tired, but determined, her focus unbroken as she scribbled notes and reviewed documents. For the first time, Reynolds saw her not as an adversary, but as someone deeply committed to the precinct and the community. A memory surfaced. His first year on the force, when he still believed in the badge as a symbol of service and justice. Somewhere along the way, he had lost that ideal, replaced it with cynicism and self-preservation. But Maya, she still believed, and she was fighting to make it real. The next morning, Reynolds sat in his car outside the precinct, staring at the folder in the passenger seat. Inside were reports, ones he knew Maya would find damning if she hadn't already. For years, he had looked the other way when colleagues bent the rules or falsified records, justifying it as part of the job. But now, he couldn't shake the image of the woman in the park, or Maya working tirelessly to fix the broken system he had contributed to. Taking a deep breath, he grabbed the folder and walked into the building. "Chief Brooks," Reynolds said, standing in her doorway. She looked up, her expression neutral but curious. "Officer Reynolds," she replied. "What can I do for you?" He hesitated, then placed the folder on her desk. This is everything I know. The incidents, the officers involved, things I should have spoken up about before." Maya's eyes flicked to the folder, then back to him. "Why now?" "Because I can't keep pretending I'm not part of the problem," he admitted. "I made mistakes. I looked the other way when I shouldn't have. But I want to make it right." Maya studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "It's a start," she said. "But actions speak louder than words, Officer Reynolds. You'll need to back this up with accountability and commitment. Can you do that?" Reynolds nodded. "I'll try." Reynolds' cooperation marked a turning point for the precinct. His testimony and evidence led to the dismissal of several corrupt officers and sparked sweeping reforms. New policies were implemented: mandatory body cameras, de-escalation training, and community engagement programs, all under Maya's watchful eye. For Reynolds, the road to redemption wasn't easy. He faced scrutiny from colleagues and skepticism from the community. But he showed up every day, volunteering for outreach programs and working to rebuild trust, one interaction at a time. Months later, at another community event, Reynolds stood beside Maya, handing out food and supplies to families affected by a recent storm. The same woman who had confronted him at the park approached, her expression cautious but not hostile. "Thank you," she said simply, nodding toward her young son, who waved shyly at Reynolds. Reynolds nodded, the smallest smile tugging at his lips. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. As Maya watched the interaction from a distance, she felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. Change was slow, but it was happening. And in moments like this, it was enough to keep her fighting. For Reynolds, redemption wasn't a destination. It was a journey. One he was finally willing to take. The precinct had begun to shift. What was once a rigid, insular environment had started to crack open under Chief Maya Brooks's leadership. The transformation was not immediate, nor was it easy, but it was undeniable. Officers who once scoffed at community outreach programs now participated reluctantly, their duty uniforms visible at local events. New policies were introduced: mandatory body cameras, transparent reporting procedures, and regular community check-ins, all aimed at rebuilding the trust that had been eroded over the years. Maya walked the precinct halls with a steady confidence. Her presence was a constant reminder of the new standards she demanded: accountability, fairness, and respect. The tension that had greeted her arrival had not disappeared, but it was softening. People were adapting, even if grudgingly. For Mark Reynolds, the transformation was deeply personal. His demotion had come as no surprise. It was the natural consequence of his actions and his failure to uphold the standards of his badge. At first, the blow to his pride had been unbearable, leaving him sullen and withdrawn. But over time, something shifted. Conversations with Chief Brooks, the stern but fair guidance of his remaining allies, and his own encounters with community members had forced him to confront his role in the precinct's history. Slowly, Reynolds began to take steps toward change. At Maya's urging, he joined a community outreach program focused on rebuilding trust between officers and residents. At first, he dreaded the meetings, expecting hostility and judgment. And he got plenty of both. "You think showing up here erases what you did?" one young man asked during a heated session. Reynolds didn't flinch, though the words stung. "No," he said simply. "It doesn't. But I'm here to listen, and to do better." He left that night feeling the weight of their words, but instead of retreating, he returned the next week. And the week after that. Gradually, his presence became less of a target and more of a bridge. One evening, Maya sat in her office, reviewing reports from the precinct's new transparency initiative. Complaints against officers had dropped significantly in the past 3 months, and participation in community programs had risen by nearly 40%. It was progress, but Maya knew better than to let the numbers lull her into complacency. Her mind drifted to the journey that had brought her here. The long nights, the battles fought against systems resistant to change, and the personal cost of standing firm in her values. Her childhood promise to fight injustice had shaped every decision she'd made, but it hadn't come without scars. She opened a drawer and pulled out an old photograph. It showed her as a young girl standing beside her father, his arm draped protectively around her shoulders. It was a reminder of the moment that sparked her journey, the injustice she witnessed, and the vow she made to herself. Maya placed the photo back in the drawer and straightened in her chair. The work was far from over, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope that real change was possible. The auditorium buzzed with quiet chatter as residents filled the rows of seats. The community meeting had been organized as a platform for Maya to address ongoing reforms and to hear directly from those most affected by the precinct's past failures. Maya stood backstage, taking a deep breath. She had spoken at countless events like this, but the stakes always felt high. She glanced at her note cards, neatly organized in her hand, and then tucked them away. Tonight, she would speak from the heart. As she stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. The audience was a mix of emotions: gratitude, skepticism, even outright hostility. Maya met their eyes one by one, her steady presence commanding attention. "Good evening," she began, her voice carrying across the room. "Thank you for being here. Your time, your voices, and your trust are things I don't take lightly." She spoke of the changes already underway, the policies implemented, the officers held accountable, and the efforts to rebuild a foundation of trust. But she didn't shy away from the challenges that remained. "I know that words alone won't undo the harm that's been done," she said. "Trust isn't built with promises. It's built with action, and it's earned, not demanded." Her honesty resonated with some, while others remained guarded. A woman in the back raised her hand, her voice trembling as she shared her experience with an officer's abuse of power years ago. Maya listened intently, offering her a sincere apology and a promise to investigate further. The meeting lasted well into the evening, with Maya fielding questions and addressing concerns. By the end, the mood in the room had shifted slightly. It wasn't an overwhelming wave of support, but it was a start, a willingness to engage in the conversation. Among the attendees sat Reynolds, his presence unnoticed by most. He had chosen a seat in the back corner, his expression subdued but thoughtful. He hadn't planned to come, but something inside him had urged him to see this through. As he watched Maya handle the crowd with grace and sincerity, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: pride in the uniform he wore. It wasn't a redemption arc neatly tied with a bow, but it was a step. When the meeting ended, Reynolds lingered in his seat, watching as Maya spoke with residents one-on-one. Finally, he stood and walked toward the exit, but not before catching Maya's eye. She nodded to him, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had both undertaken. The precinct's transformation was far from complete. Change was a slow, often painful process, and there were still officers resistant to the new standards. But under Maya's leadership, the foundation for something better had been laid. As Maya left the auditorium that night, she felt the weight of the work still to be done. But she also felt a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't just about reforming a precinct. It was about building a legacy of justice, one step at a time. Reynolds walked out into the cool night air, his hands in his pockets. He didn't know what his future in the department would look like, but for the first time in a long time, he was willing to find out. In the distance, the city lights flickered, a reminder that change, like those lights, began with a single spark. Together, they were starting to illuminate the path forward. Under Chief Maya Brooks's leadership, the precinct began its journey toward accountability and trust, implementing reforms that brought hope to the community. Officer Mark Reynolds, humbled by his mistakes, started taking steps to redeem himself, quietly rebuilding bridges he once burned. Maya knew the work was far from over, but the small progress they made proved that change, though slow, was possible. Together, they embraced a future shaped by justice and empathy. If this story of justice, accountability, and redemption resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and comment your thoughts below. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that inspire change and spark important conversations. Together, we can shed light on the impact of empathy and reform in our communities.